Welcome to the Quantum Feedback Loop podcast. I'm your host, James Myers, and I also publish the Quantum Record, which features the latest in science and technology. Today's subject is human activity in outer space. Space governance has been on the international agenda since the United Nations Outer Space Treaty of 1967, but it receives little media coverage when wars, climate change, and other problems on Earth seem more pressing. Jessica West really opened my eyes to the very active world of human activity up in the skies, the crucial importance of satellites and other space assets to our everyday living, and the very real threats of what's becoming an extremely congested and competitive environment beyond Earth's atmosphere. And I think most importantly, the fantastic opportunities that lie ahead for humanity if we get the questions of space governance right. Jessica holds a PhD in global governance and is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. In her work as senior researcher at Project Plowshares, Jessica's aim is advancing peace and security in outer space through a humanitarian focus that benefits people and the planet. As part of this work, Jessica interacts regularly with key United Nations bodies tasked with space security and space safety issues. We began our discussion reflecting on the ideals set out 57 years ago in the United Nations Outer Space Treaty. Although the UN might not be the most effective body at the moment for earthly issues, what struck me from Jessica's description of its work is the UN's continuing potential to develop rules and norms for humanity's peaceful enjoyment of the benefits and opportunities of space. Maybe you'll come away from this discussion as hopeful as I now am that our differences on Earth don't need to extend into space. As Jessica notes at the end of our discussion, there are always pleasant surprises. Drawing on lessons from global arms negotiations that began in the Cold War era, as Jessica says, difficult issues often go nowhere until suddenly they go very quickly. And as she says, when you bring everyone together, that's when magic can happen. It doesn't always happen, but every now and again, something fantastic takes place. So I'm beginning to feel optimistic about the chances for getting the tricky questions of space governance right. Every one of us is a stakeholder in space, and we can look forward to the potential of the UN Summit of the Future in September of this year. While there may not be radical outcomes, as Jessica says, any sort of coming together as a global community is a win. So here's my discussion with Jessica West on space governance, the challenges and opportunities for humanity beyond Earth. Well, welcome, Jessica, to the Quantum Feedback Loop. Really glad to have you here today and really interested to learn about space governance as an emerging subject. It's something that we don't really hear about a lot in the press, but I think it's becoming an increasing concern. So really interested in hearing what you have to say about it and what your experience is with it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's not a new topic, but you're right that it's not been in the public eye very much. I think mostly because we've been lucky and had reliable access to space for several decades now. And with more actors, more security challenges, more environmental challenges, we're starting to learn a lot more about why we value space and what we need to do to maintain that value and maintain it as a resource for all of humanity.
And that's great. I think there's a really interesting history of this too that I'd like to understand, and I think our listeners would like to understand. It's starting, maybe with the fact that you work with Project Plowshares, and its history goes back to, I guess it was founded in 1976. I remember Project Plowshares when I was in high school. It was a big subject, but the topic back then was nuclear weapons, and which is still, a huge concern, of course. But at some point, I guess Project Plowshares and you, in your own experience, moved to the subject of space governance. So, can you just tell us a bit about that history and how that came to be?
Yeah, so Project Plowshares has been working on this topic since 2002, 2003. So it's a long time. It even takes me by surprise sometimes when I realize our history and track record on this topic. And it's not unlike why we got involved in nuclear weapons and why we're involved in other areas of technology and security governance from the perspective of peace and humanitarian security and well-being on Earth. So around the early 2000s, this was the time when the topic of missile defense had become very big once again. So as some listeners might recall, this was a big topic in the early 1980s with the Space Defense Initiative and the prospect that there would be missile interceptors in space that could magically somehow shoot down incoming nuclear warheads and keep everybody safe forever. And it turned out to be a myth, an expensive myth, and not something that was pursued, but it became big again after the 2000s. And the focus has really been on ground-based and sea-based interceptors, so missiles located on Earth that can intercept other missiles, but there's always been this space-based component to it, kind of at the back of our minds in the blueprints. And this was also a time when Canada was thinking about joining the US Missile Defense Initiative. And what about space was a question that was lurking, because at the time, Canada was one of the most I guess the strongest proponents of maintaining outer space as a weapons-free zone. And so joining in with a weapons program that might at some point involve a space-based component was something that they really wanted to talk about and think about. In the end, Canada didn't join. That's a whole other podcast that we can talk about someday. But there was a desire to discuss this topic of potential space weaponization in a way that might advance it. Obviously, it had been on the international agenda for several decades at that point, but it was hard to talk about. It was very strategic. It was very one country versus another country. And so the government of Canada came to us and helped put together an international consortium that included McGill University, the Space Policy Institute at George Washington. And our focus was to talk about security in outer space from a holistic or a comprehensive approach. And so we decided that security includes safety, security includes sustainability. Security includes our ability to use space in ways that benefit all of humanity. It includes the kinds of policies and strategies that we adopt. And it includes that hardware counter space component as well, but that these are interrelated, they affect one another, and we can't talk about one in isolation without understanding the knock-on effects of the others. And I think you're seeing the benefits of that approach. One of the only kind of concrete initiatives that has emerged in recent years is this growing moratorium, kicked off by the United States, but something that Canada had long been interested in not having destructive tests of anti-satellite missiles in space. And a big driver of that is sustainability. These weapons have security implications. They negatively affect the security dynamics, and the threat perceptions in space, but they also make a big mess of this incredibly fragile environment. And I think it really goes to show that you can't look at topics in space individually and isolated from one another, because everything's connected and it all is connected back down to Earth as well.
Hmm. And you mentioned those anti-satellite weapons tests. I guess there was one in 2021. I think the Russians conducted a test and blew up one of their own satellites, I guess, scattering over 1,500 trackable parts across space, adding to this increasing growth of space junk, I guess, that we have to deal with too. And that's one of the issues that I want to discuss. But, and I guess now there's been rumors that there's been nuclear weapons test in space. But before we get into that, maybe if you could just take us back to maybe what seems to be maybe the beginning of the serious discussion about this back into 1967, I think, the Outer Space Treaty, and maybe just tell us a little bit about that and what its goal was, and is that framework that was established in 1967 still active now, or is it changing?
Yeah, so states have been talking about, what would space governance look like? What would the rules of using and accessing space be long before anything human was launched into orbit? But obviously, with the launch of Sputnik and subsequent American satellite launches, as space opened up to physical human presence, this question became really urgent at the United Nations. There's a lot of back and forth. I have a chapter published recently with the Oxford Handbook for Space Security that walks through some of the history, if anyone is interested in diving in. And I refer to sort of the myth of peace in outer space. So, what is peace and what does it look like? That was a very big concept for space. Obviously, every country in the world had a stake in what this would look like. And so there was sort of a lot of back and forths, but a special committee was set up at the United Nations, which eventually became the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And that's where the 1967 treaty was finally drafted. It's more of a framework treaty. It's a set of principles. It's a pretty short read for anyone who's interested, but it's also an inspiring read. States were aware that what they were doing was going to have a big impact on the future. And so you see a lot of really important principles that were shaping global governance in the 1960s in general, a concern for environmentalism, a concern for benefits of all humanity. So you might see that as sort of this universalistic approach to human rights and human well-being in a global community. And those aspirations are very much embedded in the treaty. And then you also have some more practical aspects, such as the fact that international law applies to outer space, including the United Nations Charter, which of course gives states the right to self-defense. And so, that's a more of a realpolitik angle that comes into the treaty. I think it's a wonderful document. I think the drafters were prescient in wanting to maintain outer space as a global commons, as a space that should be accessible and benefit everyone, and as a place that ideally we want to prevent from becoming overly militarized or weaponized. So when it comes to my work on the sort of the hardware of space weapons and the security side, there's a firm ban on the placement or testing or use of nuclear weapons in outer space. And that, of course, reflects the era, as you note. This was, near the height of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons were a scourge on the Earth, and we didn't want to extend that to outer space. That's the limits. And so a lot of our work since then has been to think about what other kinds of things do we not want to have in outer space and how do we get there?
Hmm.
But certainly the Outer Space Treaty, I think, is as relevant today as it ever was.
Hmm. And, I guess the fact that it was struck 22 years after the end of a war that killed 60 million people and after the dropping of two atomic bombs, I guess, how did we get from then to now where there's this increased militarization on Earth again, and increased pressures and tensions, which I want to talk about, which it seems now maybe some of that's being exported into space. And so what's the major shift that happened since that kind of inspiration universalistic viewpoint that you talked about?
So you have to dive into my book chapter a little bit more. Behind a lot of the aspirational language is very much a longstanding military focus to outer space. There's a fabulous book that my colleague Blevin Bowen has written called Original Sin. And so he'll walk you through the history for anyone who's interested. But we know, the first space launchers were rooted in missile technology, V2 technology. And so the capability to use space was really rooted in the military. And the desire to have satellites in outer space was also rooted in the military. Space gave a wonderful advantage to be able to see what was happening on Earth. And in many ways, that was stabilizing, especially when we had the advent of some of our most important arms control agreements that restricted nuclear weapons. It provided states with a way to monitor what other states were doing, to have some sort of trust that agreements were being abided by. And to have a sense of what other states were investing in technology-wise. So it provided some transparency. There have been oodles of different military programs aimed in some way or another at weapons. I think we've been lucky. Space weapons are pretty hard to do, and they're very hard to do well. And we have no lack of means to hurt one another using Earth-based technology. And so we've largely been spared from the effects of potential weapons in space. But it doesn't mean the ideas and the intent and the effort hasn't been there. Where we are today, I think, is that space has become so embedded in absolutely every military and civilian activity on Earth that it is indispensable. And it's also a good way to interfere with other states' abilities to do other kinds of military activities on Earth. And so space itself has become a target because it's become so valuable. And it's vulnerable. We can see satellites orbiting the Earth. When you look up at night, you'll see the streaks across the sky. Sometimes you might think it's a shooting star, and someone like me says, sorry, that was a satellite, which I think is still cool. But they travel in predictable orbits. They have electronics that are largely unprotected. There's a lot about the physics of outer space that limits how we do peace and security in outer space. And so I think that's where we are today, where Space is vulnerable, space is essential, and we have rising military competition on Earth.
Mhm.
And so space is in the crosshairs.
And we're a lot more reliant. I'm just thinking of our individual lives, like just ordinary people like me, and I think a lot of the people listening to this just maybe don't realize how reliant we are on space for our daily living. Like I'm thinking GPS navigation, satellite communications, internet received by satellite, all of this, basic economic functions, I think. How many ways are we reliant on space now?
Honestly, it's hard to explain because it is so embedded. And so you can show the broad strokes, as you pointed out, navigation. So the ability to have things moving around the Earth depends on outer space, everything from airplanes to trucking and the delivery of your Amazon packages every day. Communications, absolutely. And it's not just satellite communication. Satellite technology empowers other forms of communication on Earth. The timing function of GPS is required for the internet to work. And very small disruptions to these capabilities can have massive ripple effects on Earth. Agriculture is using space. Um, our water and electricity grids are using space. And when we think about all these ways that we're using space, it's also important to realize that we haven't been very good at developing, here's the civilian and commercial uses, and here are the military uses. The different users are very much entwined in the same hardware capabilities in space. And so GPS is an essential military capability, and it does have a separate protected military signal, but it's the same satellites that are providing the public civil signals. And that's not the only example. I think the war in Ukraine has also brought to the public attention the fact that the same Viasat and Starlink satellites that people are using for their communications and internet needs are also entwined in military uses and are also targets when they are entwined in ongoing active conflict on Earth. And so we're all sort of wrapped up into this web of being dependent on space and also being dependent on many of the same assets in outer space and same systems in outer space. And I think to me that is why peace, sustainability, environmental safety, it's also important because it's not just one user or one part of the world that is dependent, it's everybody. And we're all in the same spaceship. Boat's not a good analogy here. But we all depend on that same environment and many of those same systems.
I think there was actually recent reports about the Russians, I think, are suspected of having jammed GPS signals for aircraft. And I think that was in connection with the Ukraine war.
I mean, GPS signals are jammed all the time.
Yeah.
My colleague at Secure World Foundation, Brian Whedon, he'll point out that the vulnerabilities in GPS civil codes are intentional. What wasn't anticipated was how many countries or individuals would someday be capable of jamming those. And so there's sort of embedded vulnerabilities in some of these systems for security reasons, where you want to be able to shut down access to certain capabilities. It's an ongoing challenge. I think it's dangerous in many cases, but this certainly isn't the only example. GPS in Israel is currently being blocked for fear that it could be used for military purposes against the country. So, this ability to spoof those systems is very widespread. It just sometimes it can be terrifying when you realize the kind of systems that are using it, such as civilian aircraft.
Yeah, that is scary. It makes us think that we're vulnerable. And yet, and that yet there's good things about space. Obviously, like you and I couldn't be having this conversation over the internet without satellites.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Space is I mean, it's inspiring. I think it's important to remember too, we were talking about space governance as though, our awareness of space goes back to, the 1950s and 60s, but really human interaction with space goes back as long as humans. I think space has always inspired. It has always informed who we are, informed our questions about, what exists beyond ourselves, shaped our culture, shaped religions. It's inspiring and it's part of who we are. And satellites today bring innumerous benefits and climate change mitigation, that is almost impossible without the use of outer space.
Mm.
Most of the way that we measure what's happening on Earth happens from outer space. And many of the ways in which we can mitigate some of the harms that we do also happen from outer space. Our ability to detect things like methane leaks, to monitor what's happening in the oceans. It's phenomenal. You think about Earth observation, you think, oh, visibility and pictures, but we detect and monitor and track so many things from space, using different kinds of sensors. I'm not a very technical person, so I don't want to get into what they are, but heat and wind patterns, as well as the imagery. And of course, that imagery is used for all kinds of purposes, from monitoring deforestations to being able to track human rights abuses. So certainly, we don't want to lose space. It's just an incredibly valuable resource and brings so much to life on Earth.
Mhm. And I'm hoping to maybe touch on some of those other applications in a little bit. Maybe just before we leave the Outer Space Treaty starting in 1967, wanted to maybe just contrast the activity in space then versus the activity in space now. I mean, back in 1967, at the kind of height of the Cold War, I guess only two countries had made it into space, the US and the USSR. But now we have many nations. I think somebody, maybe you said it, that there was 100 nations now with satellites in space. We have the billionaire-owned SpaceX with thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit. Space tourism is taking off. Maybe if you could just outline the extent of the activity in space now compared to 1967.
Compared to, at the extent now compared to 10 years ago is also phenomenal. So absolutely, 1967, we have two countries. Eventually, Canada becomes the third. And, there's a slow trickle up of states who have independent access to space and or satellites in space. Um, it's slow and steady. I think space becomes a marker of advanced technology for a lot of states. In the 80s, you start to see more commercialization, particularly with broadcasting capabilities from geosynchronous orbit. It's really, though, the 2010s and beyond, where things that seemed almost fantastical or science fiction suddenly become reality. So Project Plashers, under my direction, as well as my boss, Cesar Jaramillo, we used to run the Space Security Index. And, our goal with that was to have this comprehensive assessment of what happened in space every year. I think that would be impossible today. I remember when there were just over 1,000 satellites in orbit, and that's not very long ago. That might have been, say, 2015-ish. I think we're at about 10,000 now. It
Wow.
grows so quickly that you'll see people who track this and who present, and they are constantly having to double check and update their slides almost on a daily basis. We have new satellites going into orbit. So space is now multinational. You're right. I think it's probably 80 plus countries that have some sort of national space system in place. But it's multi-stakeholder. We have loads of commercial activity that's happening, everywhere from small startups to some of the behemoth companies on Earth, such as Amazon, who are involved in outer space. We have universities and NGOs who are also developing space systems. And it's multi-activity. We have space tourism, as you say. There's also space medicine that is being developed. And so a lot of scientific research that happens in space that allows people to test and develop the kind of capabilities for use on Earth that is just really hard to do in Earth's gravity. And it boggles my mind every time I go to a space conference and I hear what people are doing. It is phenomenal. It's outstanding. And I have to say, when I first started working on this, the idea that we would have reusable launchers, that we would have this many satellites with tens of thousands of more projected to come in the next decade, kind of seemed impossible. And it just goes to show how quickly technology can move, as well as the human imagination and the human determination to make the most of the capabilities and resources that we have.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to think about all of those satellites there. And I think, I mean, I understand one of the major problems now is space junk or debris in space from things like the Russian test where they, blew their satellite into 1,500 different parts that now need to be tracked because each one of these parts, even from, old disabled satellites, could damage the other satellites going up. So I guess there's this increasing commercial interest in ensuring that the satellites are protected. And so maybe that's one impetus that's driving space governance now is to protect the economic interests of the investment in space.
Yeah, I think space sustainability has been one of the brighter spots on space governance where we have seen movement. It's important to point out that Russia is actually the fourth the fourth country to demonstrate an ability to blow something up intentionally in space using a direct hit missile. China is sort of well known for its test in 2007, which I think created the largest human-made debris cloud in orbit. It was conducted at a relatively high orbit, around I think 800 kilometers, and so those pieces largely stayed there for a very long time and dispersed quite far. The United States has also demonstrated this in 2008. India had their test in 2019, and then Russia conducted their test, as you say, in 2021. And so that's sort of the impetus behind this effort to have a moratorium to say this is bad for security, and it's really bad for the environment, and that makes it bad for everybody. And so this is one way in which we can restrain ourselves going forward. It doesn't mean that those capabilities disappear, that the interest in developing them disappears, but it might be one way of mitigating the negative impacts of them. But I think sustainability is where you see a lot of commercial interest, as you point out, in having better governance in outer space. There have been efforts, though, to mitigate space debris that go back to the 1980s. There's been an awareness that this is going to be a problem for a very long time. Some of the first debris mitigation guidelines come out of the International Agency, IADC, I'm going to get the acronym wrong. So, a grouping of space agencies that came together, largely under NASA leadership, but it included Russia and Canada, France, China, I believe. Their guidelines eventually made it to the United Nations in 2010, space debris mitigation guidelines. The UN has then expanded that work on space sustainability under the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Space that I spoke to earlier. And so there's a lot of voluntary guidelines. And then I think we're seeing states at the national level also take leadership. The United States stands out. They have been tightening the environmental rules for outer space. And so, technically the existing standard for when do you deorbit something that you're no longer using is 25 years. If we're putting thousands of objects into orbit every year, we can't leave dead satellites there for 25 years. And so that's come down to 5 years. There's pressure to be even lower. And we're seeing companies take it upon themselves to deorbit as soon as they can. So I think SpaceX is one of those companies. And you're right, there's a self-interest there. We can't use an environment that we destroy. And even itty bitty tiny pieces of debris in outer space, which you can have from the remnants of other accidents in space or debris hitting each other, even those tiny pieces can damage and destroy sensors, knock out a physical capability of a satellite. And then the bigger pieces are obviously collision risks. And so space operators are having to deal with a barrage of potential collision risks every single day, to the point where it feels like crying wolf. There's so many warnings that it can be hard to know, when do you maneuver, when do you risk a maneuver to get out of the way, which can create more risk in some ways, more uncertainty, use fuel, reduce the lifespan of your satellite, which also has environmental impacts. And when do you do nothing? And so that's a problem that I think is quite urgent. It's being addressed through, I think, better technology. So better capabilities to know exactly where things are in orbit and to have better risk assessments so that you reduce the number of warnings that each operator receives, but also better coordination among operators. So there's a lot more to do there, but I still think it's a bright spot. It shows that there is a multi-stakeholder interest in getting space right in ways that we have not necessarily gotten right on Earth.
That's encouraging to hear it. And I want to talk a bit more about that level of both private sector cooperation and international cooperation. But first, you mentioned that there's in another podcast you mentioned that there's a tense situation in space now and we need to lower the heat. I think those were your words. I'm just wondering what is the major contributor to that tension and what's the best shot for reducing the temperature?
Well, I think the major contributor is really what's happening on Earth, which is sort of a growing security competition. I don't want to say military standoff yet, but certainly heightened competition among some of the great powers on Earth, both for military security as well as economic competition. And as we've been discussing, that is all dependent on our ability to use space. And so there's also new technologies and new capabilities being developed in space, and it's not always clear what they're being used for. And so we have satellites that are approaching other satellites very closely, sometimes following them, stalker satellites. Are they stealing information? Are they imaging other satellites, which is often the case? How do we avoid a collision? Do they potentially have capabilities on them that could inflict cyber damage, damage to sensors, physical weapons capabilities? It's very hard to know what kind of capabilities they have and why exactly they're doing what they're doing. And so Russia, the United States, China, they all have these abilities to surveil space, to surveil objects in space, but we don't always know what else they might be capable of. And so there's a real risk of tension escalation, of collisions. Do you sit tight and hope that it goes away? Do you try to maneuver and risk a collision with that object, especially if there's no coordination across states? There's also a lot of intelligence that is being leaked about different potential weapons capabilities that are under development. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and we don't behave well under radical, uncertain conditions, especially in outer space. When it's far away, we can't necessarily update, quickly protect. We don't have a lot of reactive capabilities on orbit. Things that we put there are intended to be there for a long time as well, and so they're very valuable. So yeah, I would say the environment itself is causing a lot of tensions in space. Not a lot of transparency, a lot of new technology that can be used for multiple purposes. Again, sometimes this is the commercial sector that is developing capabilities. But they could be used for both harmful and helpful purposes. So we have, advanced robotics that we might be able to use to service satellites, which is just phenomenally exciting because we could expand their life frames. We could use old satellites to do new things rather than having to launch an entire new satellite into orbit. We could also do harmful activities to other people's satellites. And so that, I think, is really what's driving a lot of tension. There's a lot we need to do. I do think there's a role for formal arms control for thinking about, what other things beyond nuclear weapons do we want to not do in space? But behaviors are also a really big part of the picture, and that's where the UN has been focused for the last few years is, can we conduct our operations in ways that reduce the perception of threat to other actors? Can we do things that signal our intent a little bit better, especially if that intent is benign or mostly not harmful? So can we do things such as issue prior notification before a maneuver so that others are aware of what's happening, which is important for safety, but it also reduces the security threat perceptions? Can we provide more information about the systems that we're putting into place? Can we agree that there might be certain kinds of space systems that we're not going to interfere with, even, using non-kinetic means like cyber and electronic interference? I think, GPS systems would be high on that list, given how reliant everybody is on those signals. And so that's sort of been the focus. And I think that would be a really good way to reduce the tensions. The problem is that states have different views about what we should be doing. And so in some ways there's tensions about what we should be doing. And we haven't managed to find a way through this dichotomy between states that want to ban weapons, which is really an initiative that has been championed by a lot for decades now by China and Russia, and those who want to focus on, it's not what you have, but how you use it approach, which is more of the Western way. To me, these are very much complementary to one another. how we behave in space can also help signal whether or not something is a weapons capability or a benign capability or a helpful capability. And so I think we need to be pursuing these hand in hand. Lots of other states think that as well. I'm hoping with time, the logic of these initiatives as they unfold will gradually start to coalesce. The UN takes a long time.
Yeah.
It's always worth it, but it's always slow.
Well, and that background was really helpful to understand. I hadn't really thought about stalker satellites. I kind of, as you were talking, I get this picture in my mind of all of these maneuvers in space with more and more objects and all of those calculations that have to go into those maneuvers, whether it's military or private sector. And of course, some more calculations that are required, especially at that distance with little capability, as you said, to maneuver and deal with the probabilities and uncertainties is, I guess,
Yeah.
can lead to potential disasters.
And you don't have to be a math person. I'm not a math person to understand kind of the sense of insecurity that comes from these activities. I mean, we've all probably been followed closely at night by somebody and you're wondering, oh, who is that person? What are they doing? What kind of capabilities do they have? Are they here to hurt me? Are they just trying to get home? Do you walk more quickly? Do you pretend that everything's cool or just keep doing what you're doing? Do you change your intended route to make yourself feel safer or not? So I think we can all sort of empathize with the types of insecurities that can arise from very uncertain situations.
So tell us a bit about the United Nations and its role, and maybe are there other supranational organizations like the European Union getting involved in space governance? I know you've spoken about maintaining a positive attitude for the potential of space governance, and when I mention the UN to people, people say, "Well, the UN's nice, but it's not really effective on Earth. So how can it be effective in space?" I mean, what's your experience with it, and what sort of outcomes do you see possibly that the UN could make positive contributions?
I understand people's frustrations. The UN can be very slow. I think that's because there's no other body quite like it. There is no other forum where all states have a voice and where we can have inclusive discussions on a lot of the most pressing issues on Earth. But when we have 198 countries, that makes inclusive discussions slow. And so I will say that, if we didn't have the United Nations, we would be in trouble. So I value this organization deeply and the work that they do. That said, their work is not easy. I'm going to say I don't think it's the United Nations' fault that they don't progress on a lot of issues. And essentially, it is a coming together of states. And so it is up to the political will of states to work together or to not work together, to pursue progress or to obstruct progress. And oftentimes states see it in their national interest to obstruct progress. On the arms control file on outer space, it's been frustrating. We have been talking about weapons in space for over 40 years now. The first resolution really goes back to 1981, and you have these two competing resolutions, one sponsored by the Soviet Union at the time, one from the United States. One says, we don't want weapons in space. One says, we need to focus on ground-based anti-satellite weapons. And we're still having this debate, this either or approach. And so, in some ways, we're stuck in the past in our space diplomacy. At the same time, we've certainly seen breakthroughs on the sustainability side under the Committee on the Peaceful Uses, and I think the work that they are doing there is phenomenal. I think that the Office of Outer Space Affairs is also doing a lot to advance the ability of all states to benefit from space and for space to be accessible today and in the future. And even on the arms control file, I think the initiative that the United Kingdom started, where the goal really was to have a conversation that is not either of these two approaches, anti-satellite weapons on Earth versus weapons in space, but to start talking about behaviors, to host a global conversation that was multi-stakeholder. It included people like me. It included the ability of commercial operators to be present in the room, as well as all states, and to have an open conversation about what do you find threatening? It really, that question really opened up the scope of how we talk about space security at the United Nations in a way that I had never seen before. And suddenly you have states saying, cyber. We find the use of cyber capabilities against satellites threatening lasers. And lasers can be used for tracking purposes as well as for harmful purposes. They're another example of that dual purpose capability. Interference with critical infrastructure. Potential interference with satellites that do command and control for nuclear weapon systems on Earth. Close approaches where we don't understand what's happening, where there's a lack of coordination and a lack of prior notification. Space debris, we find that both an environmental and a security threat, especially if you're a smaller state and you don't have the ability necessarily to maneuver as often in the presence of debris threats, or to have resiliency if something were to happen to your space system the way bigger states do. So it was just, to me, so powerful, so valuable for opening up the floodgates of what do we mean. Now, that shows us that we have a lot of problems to tackle. I don't think there's going to be any one solution to space governance. And I think governance is really the right word here. We're not talking about a single treaty or agreement. We need to have layers of approaches. We need better transparency. We need better coordination. We might need some legal agreements on, again, the really bad things that we have to avoid in outer space. But we also need shared understandings of how we should operate in ways that don't make others feel threatened unnecessarily, especially where that's not the intent. And we need to think about other actors as well, because increasingly we have commercial operators who are engaging in activities that could be perceived as threatening, either actually perceived or intentionally misperceived and misrepresented, but that's not good for business either, and that's not good for security. And so, I'm excited about where we're going. I don't think it will be easy, but the best things never are.
Yeah, and that's very true. And that's very true. I'm wondering too about whether there's anything to be learned from the arms control agreements. I guess, maybe around the time that Project Plowshares was founded in 1976, there was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties. I think there was two of them. And is there any lesson to be learned from that kind of, agreements that took place on Earth to control the very damaging potential of nuclear weapons? Is there anything to be learned from that in applying, agreements or creating agreements for space governance?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to do a study on this, lessons learned from arms control that we could apply to outer space. We wrapped that up about a year or two ago, and it was insightful. Not everything is replicable. As you pointed out, those arms control agreements were largely between two states, which makes the negotiating in many ways more straightforward, and the ability to find common ground, even though you're perceived as being on, very opposing sides. There's still a lot of interest in having shared understandings when you have two states competing with one another. When you have an entire world, it can be harder. But certainly, I think there's a lot of lessons. The biggest one is that arms control was a tool of national and international security. So it wasn't a security versus security situation. They were national interests in having limits on weapons, because, well, nuclear weapons were atrocious and a risk to human life, to Earth. But they also, there was a risk of spiraling into direct confrontation, which neither state wanted. And I think there's a lot that you could say no state wants in outer space today. One would be a huge environmental contamination of the space environment. Another would be nuclear weapons, which we have already prohibited. I can see other kinetic destructive activities being something we don't want. Intentional interference with critical infrastructure, with the systems, again, that provide the command and control capabilities for nuclear weapons, which, any sort of interference with those you immediately would assume is a precursor to a nuclear attack. And so the window for not overreacting or for calming that situation down is very, very small. But these agreements also started very practically. They weren't all encompassing in scope. They started with a few reductions on things that were easy to monitor, where you could have, if you didn't have trust in the beginning, you could develop the trust by seeing that both sides were agreeing to what they had promised. And over time, the scope of those agreements got broader And so it was sort of a bottom-up approach in many ways. And over time, the intrusiveness of how those agreements were verified increased as well. And so in the beginning, it was things that could be verified using satellites, for example, to see and to count, missile systems and weapon systems. Then there were agreements to not conceal certain facilities, again, so that there could be passive monitoring of those agreements. And then it led to things like inspections, which are incredibly intrusive. But that didn't happen overnight. That was a step-by-step process. And so I think that step-by-step approach where you start with something that can be verified, that can develop trust over time if it's implemented, can then grow. And also, it's not just one agreement. There were many different agreements that touched on different aspects of the military competition that was unfolding. To me, they formed a regime of governance over strategic competition, especially in the nuclear domain, but it wasn't sort of a one-shot big agreement, at least not at the beginning.
That's a really interesting take on the history of that. And I'm wondering, in terms of, you mentioned the UN's Office of Outer Space Affairs. Maybe if you could just explain just briefly what kind of work they do, but I'm wondering, is the work that they're doing kind of that similar to establishing that trust that happened in the nuclear agreements in terms of them perhaps developing a knowledge base about what's happening in space and also maybe some sort of ability to verify what's happening in space? Is that what the office does?
Um, Sort of. So the UN office is tied to the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. That's the committee that negotiated all of the space treaties. And so we talked about the 1967 treaty. That's the foundational agreement. And then there are other treaties such as the Rescue Agreement, the Registration Agreement, the Liability Agreement that took individual principles in this broad framework and fleshed them out, gave them more detail. So there are other treaties. There just hasn't been any in a really long time. So yeah, they sort of house these treaties. They do provide some transparency. There is a UN register, and so all objects launched into space should be registered with the United Nations, including a description of where they are and what they're doing. Sometimes that happens way after the fact. I think practice is getting better. For a long time, military satellites weren't registered. Now not all of them. Some of them are, but we still don't get very good descriptions about what all of them are doing. But what happened over time is there was a bifurcation within the UN on peaceful uses of space and non-peaceful uses of space. And it's tricky because military satellites were always included in the peaceful uses of outer space. They're legitimized that way. At the same time, they're kind of exempt from some of the rules that we would normally apply to civilian and commercial satellites. But this discussion over safety and sustainability is happening largely under the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses, and then under the UN First Committee, which is responsible for international security and disarmament. That's where we're having these sort of peace and arms control discussions, and never the two shall meet. Which is quite frustrating because I think our very first point of discussion here was about how safety, sustainability, and security are all deeply entwined, and satellite systems tend to provide services to a broad range of users. So this bifurcation is challenging for that reason, but also it provides a way for states to block discussion in one forum or another. So, when we're talking about norms, some states made the argument, well, we can't talk about debris because that is a peaceful use issue. And that is a topic that the Committee on Peaceful Use is talking about, and we don't want to take over their mandate. But in that committee, we don't talk about what military capabilities are doing because we can't talk about anything military related. And so you kind of have this gap that emerges. And in many ways, it's intentional. It's a way to not talk about certain things that some countries simply don't want to talk about. So UN-USA, the Office of Outer Space Affairs, is not involved really in the arms control side of that discussion. That is really firmly rooted in the Conference on Disarmament. We don't need to go there. It is a body where arms control goes to die recently. It's an incredibly influential body. It negotiated a lot of our core multilateral, not bilateral arms control agreements. Fantastic work, but over the last many decades, its work has largely been impeded by the fact that it only has 67 member states and they have to operate by consensus. And so you can hold one topic hostage to another topic. So that's where the draft treaty that would prohibit weapons or the use of force in outer space that was drafted by China and Russia, it sort of sits there, it's been introduced there, but that body never really does formal work anymore because they can't come up with consensus on what to talk about, let alone having those conversations actually progress. So some of the rules at the UN can make it tricky to move forward. At the same time, shouldn't we have consensus on these issues? So it's tricky. But yeah, first committee is where I'm largely focused now, which is where the arms control discussions are happening, as well as those norms of behavior. There's others as well. The ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, that's where you go to get access to radio frequency spectrum, which is absolutely essential, because if you launch something in space, but you can't communicate back down to Earth, it's pretty useless. And so, of course, as we have more and more objects going into space, the ability to manage that natural limited resource that we call the radio frequency spectrum is really important. And so that conversation is largely happening there. I don't know a lot of the ins and outs there. It's one of those organizations where I feel like I mentally shut down a little bit. They do a lot of work. It's very detailed, it's very technical. But I will say to them, they are also multi-stakeholder. And so there is commercial participation in those discussions. And I think to date, they've been doing a fairly good job of managing some of these really important natural resources in outer space, including orbital slots for geosynchronous orbit. So we certainly have a track record of being able to govern things well in space. It's just that there's a lot more topics that deserve our urgent attention today.
And I want to ask you about some of the recent discussions, I guess, you've had maybe at the UN level. Also, I wanted to ask whether the UN is offering a platform for the smaller countries who don't necessarily have a significant capacity in space to have a say in what's going on.
Yeah, this is why the UN, I think, is absolutely essential to space governance. It is where they have a say in what is going on. And this is another big change that we've noticed in, say, the last decade, where even though all states are at the United Nations, it doesn't mean that they all have a capacity or an interest in participating in every single discussion that takes place there. And so for a long time, it really was dominated by the bigger spacefaring states. But if you look at the membership of the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is not universal, not all states that are part of the UN are members of UN COPIUOS, but their membership has been exploding in recent years. I used to chart it for the Space Security Index, and even 5-10 years ago, it was growing rapidly. And now that is even more so, because states know that they have a stake in the future of outer space. States know that they're all benefiting from outer space, that requires sustainability, it requires peace, it requires safety, it requires capacity building, the sharing of technology. And so the smaller states are clamoring to get into these discussions. And the same was true of the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group, where we were discussing the norms of behavior from the security side at the UN. So that's the initiative that the United Kingdom launched a few years ago. And it was inclusive. It was open to multi-stakeholders, such as myself and civil society, but it was inclusive of all states who wanted to participate. And every region of the world was there. States that I had never heard speak formally, perhaps, to space security issues within the first committee, they were addressing that body. States came, they showed up, they voiced their participation. I have reports on that, but I would say for anyone interested to go look up the recently released UNIDIR recap on the Open-Ended Working Group, because they put together beautiful graphs that show the geographic distribution of participants, as well as speaking roles, because of course being present in the room isn't the same as being actively included in the discussion. But yes, this is a global discussion. every state in the world has a stake. Not every state in the world has the capacity necessarily to participate in every single meeting and process, but certainly there is a growing awareness that everyone has a responsibility, I think. Not just that they benefit and have an interest, but I think a responsibility to the future of their own countries as well as the whole world to make sure that we get this right, and that we steward this resource into a good place in the future.
Hmm. And as you mentioned earlier, I guess because space is used a lot now for monitoring sustainability on Earth, climate change, and all of this, that even the smallest states can have a significant stake in that future that you're talking about.
Yeah, there's no state that is not using outer space.
Yeah.
And I would say a lot of them use it for national security purposes as well. It gives you, as you say, you can monitor so much from outer space. But it's also been core to the Sustainable Development Goals. That is something that the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs has been very much involved in. So I think we still have a long way to go, but you can see this vision of space for humanity and how everyone can benefit. It doesn't happen automatically. It requires, again, political will. It requires a desire to close digital divides, to have access to data that we derive from space, to have international cooperation, which is another core principle of the Outer Space Treaty. But as we continue to meet and talk about these things, we can keep those principles at the forefront of our discussions.
Hmm. And we all have a responsibility to the future. And before I end, I want to ask you, I guess, as the ending question about our responsibility to the future and what ordinary people like me can do for that. But maybe before we get there, just if you could just mention briefly, I understand you participated in some recent meetings with I think it was a new UN committee. Maybe if you could just give us a sense of what kind of discussions are happening there or how things are specifically changing in whatever direction they're going in.
Yeah, so I talked earlier about these sort of two approaches to security in outer space, the legal ban on weapons versus norms of behavior that would focus more on how we use the things that we have in outer space. Both processes are moving full steam ahead. So the behaviors one wrapped up in September of last year. It has a new mandate to begin in 2025 for another 2-year session so that they can focus in on some of the topics that had a lot of consensus and show promise. So those close approach issues are one of them. Can we develop rules or norms around how we engage in those kind of activities? But the effort to ban weapons and use of force in outer space is also progressing. And so this year, there was a group of governmental experts. I know it's a mouthful, but basically a 25-member group of states with geographic representation that met to discuss behind closed doors, what the elements of such a treaty might look like, how would you possibly verify it, what would the scope be. This is the second time that a grouping like that has met on this topic. So the meeting in New York was an intersessional meeting that was open to all states because not all states are participating in the discussion, as well as civil society, to hear back from the chair about how the discussion are going, and then to be able to make statements so that those broader views that aren't in the room can be heard and then taken into account. And so I was pleased to have the opportunity to speak there and to talk about the need for transparency, inclusivity when we think about threats in outer space, and also just putting into practice some of the things that we have long known we have to do, and we just haven't gone from sort of talk to action, especially on the transparency side. That process is also going to have an open-ended working group of its own starting in 2025. So we're going to have these two parallel open-ended working groups, one talking about weapons and use of force, one talking about norms of responsible behavior. It's a little overwhelming. The one on weapons and use of force, I don't think I will be participating in. It doesn't look as though it's open to stakeholders beyond states. The behavior-focused one is open and inclusive to all stakeholders. I think a big challenge before us will be to have enough states who are engaged in both of those conversations, which again, it's a big ask because these are a lot of meetings. This is a lot of time. And it requires a lot of resources on the part of states to be actively engaged in both. But to have enough stakeholders that are in both so that we can try to pull them together a bit and definitely have convergence so that they are hand in hand and not one or the other. I'm always hopeful. I think you can't work in peace and arms control without being optimistic, without understanding that, there are always pleasant surprises. Often these issues go nowhere until all of a sudden they move very quickly. And so I think it behooves us to have in place all of the things that can help an issue move quickly when the right time comes. So an understanding of what agreements might look like, how we might monitor them, how we can implement things, kind of having all that groundwork in place, so that when the political moment and the window is there, we can move fast. And at least I think that's another lesson from arms control in the past. Issues are often stuck for a very long time until something happens to make them unstuck. My hope is that something that makes this issue unstuck in space is not a disaster. I think too long we wait until something terrible has happened before we take action. I really hope we don't do that this time.
I join you in that hope, and I am sure all the listeners join you in that hope too. Is there any event coming up in 2024 that we should be looking out for in particular, or is it going to be a process over a few years?
Yeah, there's a huge event in 2024, the Summit of the Future. It's not just space focused, but space is a very big component of this process. It's been shepherded by the United Nations Secretary General to set out a vision and a roadmap for the future. For some of these really pressing issues that as a global community we need to address going forward. Space sustainability as well as the security side of space are both part of that, as is engaging youth, sustainable development on Earth. So the big meeting of this summit is going to be in September of 2024 at the United Nations. And note to self, I should probably decide if I'm going to try to be there and if I can afford to stay in New York for the discussion. It's something I'm really looking forward to. I don't expect, I've seen and I've participated, provided input into, what this could look like from a space perspective. I don't expect sort of any radical outcomes, but I think any sort of coming together as a global community on a path forward on all of these issues would be a win. And then it is up to states and civil society to make sure that the momentum continues. So I think that will be important. And then, as I noted, the other UN discussions will get started again in 2025. We'll see which ones civil society gets access to and which ones we don't. But all of them will be valuable.
And that's encouraging to hear. I mean, even if nothing hard or specific comes out of it, I think certainly that discussion, as we're learning, I guess, from the UN's COP climate summits, that there is benefit to at least having the discussion and to raising the general level of awareness.
Yeah, and getting as many stakeholders involved as possible, because most of these issues affect everybody. They're not singular issues, and that's what makes them so challenging. But also, I think when you do bring everybody together, that is when magic can happen. Doesn't always happen, but every now and again, something fantastic takes place.
And to get some of that magic happening with, as I say, ordinary people like me who don't have the inside track on these issues. I don't know anybody in the space governance field except for you. But what can the ordinary person do? I mean, obviously, the ordinary person can support Project Plowshares, which is a registered Canadian charity. So call out to Project Plowshares and the work that you do. Is there one thing, if a listener wants to have an effect, is there one thing you would suggest that they could do?
I think listening in, you're already doing something, because space governance is not always an accessible topic. I think it's something where you might hear it and you're like me in ITU, your brain might kind of rebel and shut down. So you've already taken an important step. I asked this question once of an astronomer when we were talking about dark and quiet skies. And, she said, look up, appreciate what we have. And, I think that is advice that cuts across so many of our challenging issues, such as the environment and climate. Understand what we have, understand how you use it and benefit from it, and that you're a stakeholder. from a Plowshares perspective, I might say that we would all be smart to try to apply the brakes on some of the escalating military tensions and rhetoric that are surrounding so many issues these days, so that we can find space, no pun intended, for conversation, for dialogue, for different ways forward. But again, it is a multi-stakeholder domain. There's a lot of activism and activity around the astronomy community, which includes a lot of not just professional astronomers, but everyday sky watchers who are interested. And so I think that is one way to be engaged. But the commercial sector also has a really big role to play. And I think, lots of people are also following in some ways more closely what's happening in the commercial sector in space, because it is in the news and it's exciting and it's inspiring. But how do we govern those companies? How do they govern themselves? I think corporate governance can be space governance as well. It really is an area where there's layers and layers of interest and responsibility. And I think awareness really helps. And again, I think the dark and quiet skies issues is one where a lot of people are starting to understand what we mean, are starting to see that, yeah, there are sustainability issues in space. If we don't use it well, if we don't use the right technologies to mitigate the impacts of what we do, we lose the sight of the night sky. And that is something that affects everybody. And there are things that can be done. It's not, and it's happening, and those discussions are happening. But yeah, I think you've done the first step. I have to say, this is not an easy conversation to have with the general public. Space so often feels removed from Earth. And I like to point out that Earth's atmosphere actually extends way out into outer space, far beyond the Kármán line. It doesn't just stop. It just gets thinner and thinner the further up you go. And so space is embedded in Earth, and Earth is obviously embedded in space. And we all have an interest in maintaining that and learning about it. I also think it's just exciting. My son goes to a school called named after Canadian astronaut David Saint-Jacques, and that what people do in space is really inspiring younger generations to get involved, to pursue their own dreams, to come up with new ones and new ideas about what we might do and how those activities might benefit Earth. So I don't know. I think it's exciting. I think it's valuable. I think it's worth protecting, and I think it's worth learning about.
That's really inspiring. Space as the place for dreams, for the young people, I think is super exciting. And as you mentioned, citizen scientists have a role in this. Anybody has a role in this, just looking up in the sky, as you say, and looking at those satellites whizzing around.
And if you can get to a dark and quiet sky zone, because of course, my first time, I didn't know the sky looked like that. And I think we all deserve to have that opportunity.
That's a great point. Yeah, get out of the cities and look at the sky as it really is. The commercial stakeholders, as you mentioned, and I guess 2024 is a year when half the planet goes to the ballot box, and maybe we should be asking our representatives what their stand is on these things. So,
and I'm assuming that this podcast will be released after April 8th, but I myself will be traveling to the zone of totality. I think to experience one of what is apparently the most moving natural phenomenon from space that you can experience. I've never been to a full solar eclipse. I'm assuming I'm going to be one of millions of people in Southern Ontario, all trying to squeeze into that zone of totality. But I think that will also be, an opportunity to reflect on outer space, but also to see the sense of community and connectedness when you literally have millions of people in Niagara Falls all trying to see something from space. It's valuable to all of us. So I think that's also an important learning moment and an appreciation moment for what we have.
Yeah, an incredibly powerful moment. Actually, 3 days away from this recording is, and I will be outside too. I won't be in Niagara Falls, but I will be outside. So, yeah,
I won't say where I'm going because everyone's going to be trying to crowd into the same. I'm still trying to figure out how best to avoid traffic, but I think it's going to be a phenomenal day, and the weather looks great so far. Knock on wood, I didn't jinx it.
We hope. Yeah. Well, listen, Jessica, it's been great speaking to you about this. And I would really like to follow up with you maybe after the Summit of the Future and see what comes out of that discussion and really see hopefully how ordinary people are getting involved in this very important discussion. I think it deserves a lot more attention than it gets. So I really appreciate your being here and sharing your perspectives with us. I've learned so much that I really did not know before. And I think, have a deeper sense of the importance of this subject. So I really thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And remember, I'm always available. Online, people can reach out, and our materials on Project Plowshares are also online for anyone who's interested. And if there's something that you're looking for that I don't work on, I certainly know who to point you to.
Well, that's great. We will talk again. So thank you. Thank you very much for this.
All right, thanks, James.
All right, bye-bye. Our thanks go to today's guest and to you for listening to the Quantum Feedback Loop. Please subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out The Quantum Record at thequantumrecord.com. The Quantum Record is a monthly journal of philosophy, science, technology, and time, where you'll find the latest developments in our rapidly evolving technological world.